Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
We have two guests today on the Cognitive Crucible. First is Dr. Andy Whiskeyman, who is Associate Professor at the College of Information and Cyberspace at National Defense University, Professor of the Practice at the Applied Research Laboratory for Intelligence and Security, or ARLIS, and a non-resident fellow at Joint Special Operations University. Also joining Dr. Whiskeyman is Dr. Mike Berger, who is Chief of Research for the Information Warfare Organizational Unit in Peraton's Cyber Mission Sector. He also runs the largest DoD foreign audience opinion research portfolio, as well as exploratory implementation of artificial intelligence-enabled methods to evaluate the information environment. Andy Whiskeyman and Mike Berger, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
John, thanks.
Great to be here.
Great to be here. And to be partnering with Mike.
Yeah, that's
Fantastic.
Right. That's
partnering with Andy.
There you go. Excellent. Well, this is a Cognitive Crucible first, gentlemen. So both of you are returning to the Cognitive Crucible. So welcome back to both of you. And this is a dual guest episode, and previously both of you were also in dual guest episodes, and so we'll have links in the show notes to the previous discussions that both of you guys were on in this forum. And also, before we get started, I would just like to mention to our audience that for Andy Whiskeyman, his opinions are his own and do not reflect the opinions of National Defense University or any U.S. government agency. So the conversation that I'd like to have with you fellas will cover the importance of dedicated resources, especially money, to government efforts to effectively carry out operations in the information environment. So resources for OIE activities. My understanding is that this is a topic of frequent conversation within the OIE community. Why did you guys want to talk about this, and how important is it?
Well, I think it's especially important, the topic of resources. I think it drives so much. There's a reason why Coca-Cola spends $4 to $5 billion on marketing annually, even though they're the king of soft drinks. In short, in order to get your message out and resonate with large populations, and do so frequently enough to achieve recall and attitude and behavior change, or even just reinforcement, requires a significant investment. Interestingly, it is only in our field where we hear people reflect on if it's an issue that we are outspent. I've never heard a political campaign dismiss it as no big deal if their opposition is outspending them 10 to 1 on campaign advertising. So why do we write it off so easily for operations in the information environment, or OIE? And with that said, I think, Andy, you also have an opinion. People who typically don't say this in the military either, right, for capabilities.
No, absolutely, Mike. And it's, I understand that it's not an unlimited budget. And, some earlier conversation we were having, everybody's special and wants more funding. I've got that. And you have to make an argument for why spending $1 in a particular field has a good return on investment. Absolutely understand all of that. However, information is important, especially looking at the effects of Russia's war in Ukraine. You look at pundits, politicians, professional military leaders talking about the importance of information, what Russia was doing to set the stage, how well Ukraine is fighting in the information fight. Well, that doesn't come free. Russia is investing in this space. Ukraine has invested in this space. If you want to be a player in the field, you have to make smart investments. That's not only the marketing piece of being able to propagate your message, that's important, but it's about the professionalization of the workforce and deliberately organizing and thinking through that organization to maximize your ability to use information within the DoD as a joint function. I think it was 2017, Secretary Mattis at the time signs the memo that enshrines information as a joint function. I have not yet seen the rigor involved in making that happen in reality. Without that, it's just a piece of paper. So my argument is in the resourcing, you got to double down on both. It's the people with costs, right? But it's that professionalization of the workforce, the organizational structure, and then the resources in terms of money available to execute missions.
And I think, Andy, we've talked about, I mean, you'll never see anyone, say in the Air Force, simply writing it off that we find out that an adversary is outspending us on fighter planes, right? Or an admiral unconcerned that, say, China is outspending us on the Navy. It's interesting that it's, we're building ships. It's interesting that it's in our field where it's almost accepted of, it's almost like a shrug, right? As you get to certain senior echelons of, does it really matter?
Right. And it's not within the echo chamber, to quote an Austin Branch ism of the information community that recognizes it. It tends to be many that are outside that assume that it's easy. This goes back to at least Vietnam, where General Westmoreland wrote his own PSYOP leaflets, thinking that his personal message to the North Vietnamese was going to cause them to capitulate. There's a mismatch that goes deeper. And I'm not disparaging senior leaders in this space. Don't take it that way. But there's a disparity in the understanding of the professional requirements to execute in this field. And the argument I'm going to make is if we want to be serious in the information space, then you need the people and the resources to be in the field. Otherwise, you're not even showing up for the game, to mix a couple metaphors.
Right. Famously, I'm trying to make an analogy here, and I want to get your comment on it. Famously, software companies have, once the software is set up and it's operationalized and it's being sold to customers, software companies famously have really high margin, because the unit cost of another software application is really inexpensive compared to the value that it provides. And I can almost hear someone in our audience thinking to themselves, well, isn't information and information capabilities kind of like that, in that once you've got something stood up and operationalized, the marginal cost of another application of whatever that capability isn't that expensive. And so maybe information capabilities should not be resourced as much as some other defense or national security capabilities, which don't have those same kinds of marginal cost dynamics. How would either one of you guys respond to that kind of a critique?
So it's a fair critique, worthy of exploration. I would offer, I think it's a false analogy, though. Kong wrote a book, Analogies at War. I can send something to put it in the links for those that either haven't read it or want a book option. I would offer it's a little bit more like Hollywood. That would be saying, well, Hollywood just made a blockbuster movie. The marginal cost of creating a new movie to gain an audience or get a message out should be less. So movies should cost less now than they used to cost. But except they don't, because you have to capture an audience. You have to hold them with material. Software is a different animal. You can't just mix those two pieces together. Now, are there some costs? For instance, if you, I'd say you need to reach people on television. Let's say the nation of Albonia, for instance, that 60% of people in Albonia get their news off of satellite TV. Well, once you build the infrastructure for that to be present in that space, yes, the cost of transmitting drops because you've already done the infrastructure build once.
Mm-hmm.
But your content cost continues. You still have to have people who run it. You still have maintenance. You still have other costs that are involved with this. It's not a magical formula that goes on, or a cheap savings or a cheap way out. Mike, I don't know if you had any thoughts on that too.
No, just to follow. I mean, that's it exactly right. Some of the infrastructure establishment, those costs may go down, but there's a reason why they say content is king. That's what gets people coming back, right? And the talent that you have to pay for content can often go up or by quite a bit when these people become stars and the content becomes resonant. And so, keeping up with inflation as you're paying networks to get information, there's a number of ways that costs may actually increase. So it's incorrect to assume, hey, we built the investment and it should just go down from here. I mean, I think Andy had a good example. Avengers came out and it was a hit movie. It's not like each Avengers movie that came out from there, was 50 million, then 25 million or whatnot, because they already had built out the formula for it. No, the cost went up. The stars became more popular. They had to constantly keep people's attention and innovate and bring in new, special effects and things of that nature. So many things, just because you've established it doesn't mean it goes down. In some ways, it can often increase.
Yeah. Okay, great. All right. Well, so let's offer some comparison here. What sorts of resources do our adversaries commit to the information environment? What do you guys have to say about that?
We found that our adversaries spend considerably more than us in the messaging realm. China, being the largest, is estimated by multiple sources that are publicly available to spend roughly $10 billion annually on messaging, and that's billion with a B. Meanwhile, combined estimates on Russia and Iran, while lower than China, both outpace the U.S. government, coming in around the $1.5 to $2 billion mark for each of them. Nor do these numbers really tell us the full story. These figures are all publicly available estimates linked to attributed messaging platforms, by which I mean things like Russia Today or RT, and the Islamic Republic of Iran Broadcasting, which is IRIB. They do not include non-attributed messages that, such as massive bot and troll networks engaged in online disseminations. Further, these countries tend to enjoy much cheaper operating costs compared to their U.S. government counterparts. The Chinese have something called the 50-cent army, or Wu Mao, which they're called the 50-cent army because literally the saying is they get paid 50 cents a post. The Iranians have the besiege, where it's just part of their duties to go and post and message online. Even when research came out with Russia and what was it, the Internet Research Agency, I think costs averaged something like $600 to $6,000 to $10,000 a year, something like that, much cheaper than anyone operating, in our field. Just a basic defense contractor in this field, the cost of them can be around $200K plus in terms of when you add in administrative and contractual fees and things like that. And on top of that, these competitors augment their own funding with earned income from advertising, by which I mean, they actually can legally go and make a profit by putting advertising on there, and it could be tens of millions of dollars or much more. There are estimates that the Iranians, for example, made over $1 billion during the World Cup for ad placement on Iranian TV, which dominates, the country and Farsi-speaking target audiences. And, one of the things I like to say is just beyond the overall numbers. Perhaps the most telling of all is the proportion of investment of GDP, right? Spent from these countries on messaging and influence. So when you take Iran, for example, they invest roughly 0.5%, 0.5% of their GDP towards messaging, towards influence messaging or propaganda. If the U.S. did similar with influence messaging, our budget would be over $1 trillion. And so, we're way below that, right? We'll talk about that in a bit, but it kind of shows the emphasis these countries place. And that's just, messaging. When you get beyond that and talking about in the trillions, that's where China's at. They have the Belt and Road Initiative, which is building global infrastructure. A huge component of that is to build its influence, right? Not just to put itself at the center of the global economy commercially and in technology, but to build influence in all these areas. And they're dropping. It's a $4 to $8 trillion initiative. So the numbers are completely different when you start talking about where we are.
Yeah, and also in a recent episode that just came out with a fella named Dan Runde, he was talking about China's annual outlay relative to diplomacy. It's diplomatic efforts is larger than China's military spending. So China, according to Dan, is applying more resources for diplomacy efforts than they are military efforts, at least currently. So that I think that probably supports some of what you were just saying, Mike. And Andy, did you have something to chime in on there?
No, just when you look at this, couple things, a couple counter arguments come up, I think that are worth addressing. One is, well, we're not China, right? We're not a communist nation. We don't have state-controlled media. We just shouldn't be doing that. Well, I would agree with that. We shouldn't be doing that. But that doesn't mean that we throw our hands up and don't think through how to work within the constraints that we have or the opportunities that we have as a free nation. There are ways to engage in this space without going down the road of, well, we need a state-run platform to do this. No, I don't think that's the case. There are smarter ways to invest and get your message to audiences. The U.S. did this during the Cold War when we faced autocratic adversaries. The U.S. did this very deliberately, matching deeds and words. It's an art we have lost, at least since 1989. We've lost this. That's the point where Russia and China really doubled down on the efforts when they saw what information did to the world order and I'm not talking information alone. This is not magical that a newspaper article causes world change. Although there are effects with mob issues in that. What I'm talking about is the matching of deeds and words, and that's what China's doing right now. They are matching deeds and words. They're using diplomacy and activity and investments to show a cohesive picture. We are not doing that at the moment, and the efforts that we have are not adequate to address the threat we face as a nation.
Okay, guys. So maybe it would be helpful to sketch out for our audience, what the U.S. government resourcing picture looks like for information.
So it's not quite peanuts, but we are definitely being outspent. In total, when adding up, and these are all publicly available estimates, the U.S. government's pretty transparent, but when you add up the DoD MISO, the United States Agency for Global Media and Department of State messaging efforts, the USG applies just about a hair over $1 billion towards messaging. And that may sound like a decent amount, but it's not. For comparison, Geico Car Insurance has a marketing budget that is, on most years, nearly twice that to simply sell cheap car insurance domestically. Add in the fact that the combined investments of, and as we mentioned earlier, key competitors and adversaries like China, Russia, and Iran amount to over $14 billion, all with vastly cheaper operating costs and likely deep clandestine budgets. And you are looking at a serious discrepancy.
Right. So with these monetary discrepancies, how do these translate into capability disparities between the U.S. and adversaries?
Andy, do you want to take this one, or would you like me to?
No, I'll start it. I mean, there's two catchy phrases that are out there. One I think was coined by Rand, the fire hose of falsehood. And there's one that I know that Mike and I have used, the deluge of disinformation. What you end up with is an inability to really have a message even get out of the gate because of the tremendous volume that's able to be generated, particularly by China, and then oftentimes echoed by Russia and Iran, floods the market. And your message isn't even getting out. Now, that's not to say you turn on the U.S. news and you see something positive about the United States. Great. But you go to Africa, China funds the Reuters-like access to news for many African journalists, where all you get is all positive all the time on China, negative on the U.S., and never anything critical of China. Well, over time, that ends up creating an inoculation against even thinking that anything China does is bad. In fact, it counters us repeatedly. And you look at what Russia did with France in Mali in terms of using information to really undermine France's position without firing a shot. Those are all examples of where you end up when you're not able to compete in the field. You cede the ground to your adversary.
Yeah. And just to go into, something first is Andy was saying, with the deluge of it. One of the first things that even comes up is our adversaries and competitors' funding is so prolific that it's hard to even track where and what is happening, across the globe. What are their narratives and tactics? What are the malign impacts of the local population? And there's no uniform apparatus to track this across the U.S. government. There's really just a hodgepodge of different entities capturing fragments because there isn't even the resources to put into that effort to capture a lot of that. And then there's other issues as well in terms of capabilities. All three of the entities I mentioned in terms of Russia, China, and Iran have global satellite TV stations with a reach in multiple languages, as well as online news platforms, at least with Russia and China, that hundreds of millions of followers, and massive bot and troll capabilities. During the height of COVID, for instance, one study had found that half of some 200 million communications on COVID were likely derived from Russian and Chinese bots. And we've seen evidence on multiple occasions of these actors even collaborating with each other to spread malign narratives to undermine the USG and American national interests. The USG, in comparison, we maintain a limited international TV news capability through USAGM, the largest being Al Hura in the Middle East. And if you can ask people from there, the content, they don't have the investment like these competitors do. We have a variety of radio stations, Voice of America, and even though you have digital radio options, this is in a world dominated by TV and social media. And there are much smaller online messaging budgets available to USAGM, Department of State, and DoD. But again, much smaller in comparison to these other actors. And with DoD, a lot of this budget still remains tied up in countering violent extremist organizations. And then so that it enhances the disparity even more. One of the things that comes up is sometimes as a counter argument we hear as well, the US president can go up and interview the media and reach the world. And that's true. But there's a difference, between the reach of one figure versus an apparatus that's able to reach globally. And the US government struggles with that from a government perspective. They can message, but it's very restrictive in capabilities in terms of scope and geographic space. And its ability to message beyond a single country, or at best what we would consider a combatant command AOR, so AFRICOM or EUCOM, can prove very challenging and infrequent.
And the philosophy behind that is I would argue flawed as well. It's a very passive. I'm just going to put the message out and allow it to do its own thing, as opposed to investing in the personnel to track and to assist with ensuring a forward presence. Cybercom's got a defend forward concept with cyber. Well, I think information ought to be the same way in terms of some respects, is looking where there's a challenge. And we're not, by no means are we arguing about creating inventing things. The origin of propaganda, I mean, it got a bad name in World War II, was not a bad name. It's merely propagating what is truth. Well, the U.S. has a great story to tell. We just need to tell the truth. But you need mechanisms to do that, to engage with honesty. I mean, a previous episode, Dr. Joe Goldenziel mentioned lawfare with the Philippines and what the Philippine Coast Guard is doing. I thought it was interesting. She called it information lawfare. I would just call it information, right? And using law as a part of that is just a natural extension of it. But that's an example of tying the two things together. But you still have to tell the story. And so that's part of it, is the philosophy, and the resources follow the philosophy. And so there are a lot of things that need to get worked on with this.
Right. So you guys have made your case about financial disparity in resourcing and capability disparity. Well, what about the actual efficacy of messaging for adversary messaging compared to friendly messaging?
So we've seen numerous examples that this propaganda has been effective. We've seen large segments of Middle Eastern populations believe that the U.S. government created ISIS and Al-Qaeda. We've seen during COVID that the disinformation was very effective. Per an article that Andy and I published while at US CENTCOM, and that's linked in the to this podcast, we found that large segments of the Iraqi and Syrian population blame the U.S. government for the spread of coronavirus. Specifically, in a nationally representative survey in the Arab majority portions of Iraq, 67% of Iraqi respondents believe the foreign force was behind COVID-19, with an overwhelming 72% majority naming the United States as that force. More recently, we've seen successful efforts by Chinese and Russian propaganda in the global South, assigning blame for Russia's war in Ukraine to the United States, NATO, and even Ukraine itself. And China's done a great job of using that to also kind of build their own influence, show that they're the adult in the room that's pushing, for a diplomatic resolution on the one hand, while on the other, they're heavily amplifying pro-Russian narratives. Finally, while Andy and I focus on foreign policy, it should also be noted that Chinese, Russian, and Iranian propaganda have all been well documented to engage in malign influence in the United States, meddling in elections, and pushing disinformation to exacerbate domestic schisms. Unsurprisingly, Chinese propaganda was documented as increasing by 500% in the USA between 2016 and 2020. So we've seen a lot of efficacy in terms of pushing things to a large degree from these investments that our adversaries and competitors have made in this field.
Right. Well, so it's come up a number of times in this podcast forum about the importance of partners. And so I wanted to ask explicitly about, what your thoughts were on partnerships and how partnerships might be able to help or potentially solve this problem.
Andy, you want to take this one?
Yeah, great question. Partnership is critical, just like it has been with the wars that we've fought and won for millennia, right? Partnership is absolutely critical in all domains, but it doesn't replace, it doesn't lift the burden, it doesn't evacuate the need to be in the space yourself. So having close partners in the information space where values align and national interests align and really truth aligns, great. That's just more opportunity to get the message across and to show the disparity between a world vision that Russia has, that China has, and what much of the West has. But it doesn't replace it. I mean, you can't offload it. You can't say, for instance, it's often said one of our closest allies is the United Kingdom. And I wouldn't disagree with that statement. But you can't say, hey, England, Great Britain, you got the messaging on this. We're not going to invest in it. Have at it. That doesn't work that way. You work in partnership with it. any more than you would offload the requirement for freedom of navigation missions to another nation and say, well, we don't need a Navy. The Royal Navy is pretty awesome. Let's just have the Royal Navy handle issues for us, and let's start uninvesting in some of the Navy ships that we have. No, you work complementary to one another, but it doesn't replace it. And that's the flaw in the philosophy of outsourcing what it is you're doing, or making assumptions that somebody else will just handle it.
And I think the problem is, so we certainly embrace the need for partners, but the problem is when people see it as the easy button, as Andy says, is to outsource it. Two big issues is, first, most of our partners, and there are exceptions, UK is one of them, but most of our partners do not they've not made the investment to even really contribute largely to the messaging capability. So they have their own investments to make before they've reached a point where they can contribute. And the second, just to harp on it, that where interests don't always align. I mean, Turkey is an example of that during Operation Inherent Resolve. NATO ally, we both agreed that ISIS, was bad, need to be stopped. But while our interests aligned there, our agreement on the methods to do so, were publicly known to be divided. There was not agreement over mobilizing the Kurdish YPG into the Syrian Democratic Forces to liberate land. And that was manifested in messaging that came out from Turkish-backed media, as well as Qatari with Al Jazeera, which essentially framed liberation of places like the middle Euphrates Rivers Valley as, being fraught with civilian casualties, and was even characterized often as ethnic cleansing of the local Arab population. So you may have partners, but that doesn't mean they'll necessarily always align on messaging topic. And that's on things like combating a terrorist group as universally opposed as ISIS. Imagine now when you make it about state actors who many of our partners, their imports and exports and their economy may be dominated by relationships with them. And suddenly it becomes orders of magnitude more complicated. So again, strongly endorse working with partners to augment the capability, but it's not the solution in and of itself.
Right. So you guys have laid out the problem, and now someone who is in a position of who's in a position potentially to do something about this. What are the kinds of recommendations that you would make to these people?
Andy, if you don't mind, I'd like to do the non-military take. I'm going to let you go.
Yeah, sure, that's fine. Go ahead, Mike.
So I think at its most basic, there's a mindset issue. So as a community, we really need to feel comfortable admitting that more resources are needed. And we shouldn't feel compelled to silence others in our community when they ask for those resources. Time and again, I've witnessed senior members of our community critically remarking that we will never see an increase in the resources available, and that we effectively need to just suck it up, make do with what we got. And I've seen this actually in varying degrees at previous Phoenix challenges. I strongly believe that this is the wrong approach. I think at a minimum, we should empower each other in obtaining the resources we need to effectively fight back. Further, I think that most practitioners and leaders in our field, I think that the more there are practitioners and leaders who vocalize the need for realistic resourcing, the better we are overall, because we should be upfront. If you're being asked, a very basic ability to tweet messages for one country that's dominated by, say, Russian satellite TV, and another country is building its own paramilitary there, we need to be upfront and say, hey, look, there's no way that these resources align to the mission that you're asking us to do. And this should be sort of a consistent way that we approach it. And it's not to say that I think we should be, that scrutiny should be disregarded or blank checks should be written. I believe that empirical assessments should play a key part in requests for additional resources. If more money is needed, you should be able to convey the effects you're achieving and what you believe you could achieve if you have more. You should be able to convey the return on investment. But ultimately, I really think that as a community, we need to feel, stop shooting each other down as we go out for resources and see it as we need to be upfront. Here's what we're up against, and here's why we need this support. Andy, I'll let you talk about your views more from the military side of the request.
Yeah, absolutely. Just 2 points. One, first of all, I'm heartened by the work that's going on within the information community on assessments and working through qualitative and quantitative best industry practices for how to assess that return on investment for dollars spent versus behavior change or conceptualizing an idea or changing a thought on something. I think that is starting to come along, and it's good. There is a challenge with expectation management in that, though. You drop a bomb on a bridge, the bridge is blown up, and everybody says, "Great, victory." Wait a second. Your adversary has boats, and you actually increase their logistics flow because the bridge was a bottleneck. The level of scrutiny of assessment over a 240-character tweet vice a JDAM is problematic from an assessment's perspective in terms of expectations. That needs to get worked through. That's one challenge in this space. The second one is in the organizational structure, I think. And I'll just speak personally here, given the amount of time that I spent in CENTCOM, which I wholeheartedly believe is still the crossroads of strategic competition. When you look at the Belt Road Initiative, when you look at flow of trade, energy, etc. But there are many in the community who would say, well, hey, wars are over in Iraq and Afghanistan. ISIS is defeated. Let's strip all of that out and peanut butter spread it across the globe. No, I would argue that's the wrong question. The right question is, okay, hey, CENTCOM has been successful in how it organized in some respects, and some of that is my bias, having been there. But why isn't that model being adopted in AFRICOM? Why isn't AFRICOM's J39 coming up in terms of resources to be more on par with what it takes to even make a dent on an information fight? Why isn't INDOPACOM growing in size in its J39 or J10? Why isn't UCOM growing in size? We're almost asking the wrong questions in terms of, let me steal this from over here to move it somewhere else. No, the right question is, what is the right base structure for an information fight within, for instance, a combatant command? Why isn't there a J59? Why isn't there a J29? If you really want to be serious about this, you need to apply that sort of rigor. And I'm not talking about a manpower study that comes back to tell you to do more with less. I'm talking about deliberately thinking through the organizational structure that you're going to apply to this fight, because your adversaries in this fight 24/7 globally, to include the homeland. You've got to get serious about this space by making that argument and then having informed recommendations and discussions about risk and offset. Because you're not going to get, for instance, right now, $1 trillion budget. But that doesn't mean don't lay out an argument for what you would do if you had one, or what that would bring you to dial back from that. Don't start from a null hypothesis.
All right. Well, some great recommendations and a thought-provoking conversation that sounds like it needs to be had up and down, horizontally and vertically across the U.S. government in order to adequately address this challenge that you guys have unpacked for our audience today. And with that, Andy Whiskeyman and Mike Berger, thank you both so much for being guests on the Cognitive Crucible.
Thank
John,
you.
thanks for having us.
Pleasure.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.